Coming to you from a cozy little condo high atop Old Fourth Ward, Atlanta. Welcome to The Ron Show on America One Radio. Here's your host, Ron Roberts.
All right, we have fresh polling to dive right into, and if you are sort of pseudo new to this show, well, I don't blame you. It's a recent development that we are on Progressive Voices via TuneIn weeknights, 7 to 8 p.m. You can find the show earlier if you like, usually via podcast. I try to post a podcast by mid-afternoon, sometimes earlier, sometimes later. The show also airs 9 to 10 a.m. on America One Radio. That is available via the America One Radio app. We also replay 5 to 6 p.m. But thank you for joining us. I love being on Progressive Voices. That's a fantastic outfit and grateful to have them on. Enough about that. Let's get to the polling. We have swing state and national polling that shows exactly what we would have expected it to show since the changeover atop the Democratic Party ticket. There was a lack of enthusiasm, easy to call it what it was, with Joe Biden running for re-election. He knew it. He saw it. A lot of Democratic Party insiders knew it, saw it, and had been hand-wringing, myself included, not that I'm an insider, but I was right there with them, hand-wringing. I don't see the enthusiasm. This isn't a Joe thing. This is, we aren't excited as a nation about two 80-year-old plus men running for president, and a malaise had set in, right? President Biden also had the weight of all that had transpired in his presidency, all that he inherited before even becoming president and having to struggle dealing with. He also had his age to deal with. And that first debate made pretty clear that there are going to be some nights where he's not very sharp. And America just didn't warm up to the idea. America, however, does seem to be warm to the idea of continuing the Biden legacy through his vice president, who is now the nominee of the Democratic Party. So we'll dive into some polling. I have Nate Cohn from the New York Times, his new column lined up, where he dives into Pennsylvania and other swing state and national polling that shows something of a trend. And we have fresh Atlanta Journal-Constitution, University of Georgia polling as well that came out yesterday. And to get to the headline, let's start here in Georgia, where the race has tightened significantly. Donald Trump, amongst all voters, receiving 46.9%. Kamala Harris within the margin of errors at 44.4%. That is a 3.5% gap within the margin of, a 2.5% gap. My apologies. Better at math than that. Well within the margin of error. When we look at demographics, there is a huge gulf still between Trump and Harris with male voters. Trump receiving 54.6% to 35.1% for Harris. Women, big gulf in her favor, 52 to 40.8%. Amongst white voters, huge gulf, huge. Although I would tell you, if she's able to just narrow this slightly, she can carry Georgia. Donald Trump wins the white vote 65.4 to 29.9%. I think the magic number is 1 out of 3 white voters for Kamala Harris. Amongst black voters, 77.4% for Kamala Harris, 9.2% for Donald Trump. A little bit of a surprising number there. There is an 11.6% undecided. I would be curious to know how much of that undecided is male voters. I happen to think that that would be a lot of black male voters who are undecided. Amongst other non-white voters, it appears we have something of a big chunk of undecided, 20%. Kamala Harris with a slight margin of 39.7 to 37%. Amongst young voters, this is actually a bit of a surprise. Amongst young voters, we have a statistical tie within the margin of error, 50.7 to 46.6%. Would you be at all surprised to learn that that's Donald Trump who has that margin? The 18 to 29-year-old voter. I'm a little surprised by that. I also happen to think that when we go back and look at vote totals after Election Day in Georgia, that will not be the case. I'll just go ahead and tell you now, Kamala Harris will win the 18 to 29-year-old vote in Georgia. There are, and this is kind of my mindset for a lot of folks who are like hand-wringing about polling. Why is it still so close? I actually think there is a large chunk of voters who are not going to show up in polling because they are not likely voters. They are new registrants. They may not even wind up on anybody's call list or email database. They're obviously not likely voters because they haven't voted yet. Although, if you've registered in the last few weeks, in my mind, you're a likely voter. You have the Taylor Swift effect. Yeah, I think the 18 to 29 vote in Georgia and nationally will swing to Kamala Harris. Amongst 30 to 44-year-olds, actually, though, Kamala Harris has a wide margin of a lead there, 49.1%. Wow. To 35.9% for Trump, 13.7% undecided. Again, this is all in Georgia. This is the latest Atlanta Journal-Constitution poll. Amongst 45 to 64-year-olds, Trump with a 49.4 to 41.9% margin. And amongst voters 65 years of age or older, 52.8% for Donald Trump, 41.9% for Kamala Harris. Amongst educational divides, for those with a high school degree or less, Donald Trump, the heavy favorite there, 64.6% to 28%. Amongst those who have some college, it's a statistical dead heat, 46.4 to 45.5. I'll give you the crosstabs, by the way, the PDF of this in the show notes today at ronshowatl.com. That's where you go for that once I've put it to podcast. Now, college graduates, 56.9% for Kamala Harris, 32.8% for Donald Trump, with 8.2% undecided. A few more nuggets in this polling that I'll share with you this morning. Again, you'll get this in the show notes. Amongst liberals, follow with me here. Amongst liberals, Harris gets 86.3% to Donald Trump 6.8%. What? With 6.1% undecided. We know where that will swing. Amongst conservatives, Donald Trump gets 84.8% to Kamala Harris's 9.8% and 4.7% undecided. Donald Trump apparently in this polling gets 6.8% of liberals, which makes no sense. Kamala Harris gets 9.8% of conservatives who participated in the poll. And I believe that actually makes total sense. Amongst moderates, 65.7% for Kamala Harris to Donald Trump's 22.1%. Kamala getting only 2.2% of those who profess to be Republicans. Donald Trump, 94.4%. Amongst those who profess to be Democrats. 86% for Kamala Harris, 5.8% for Donald Trump, and 6.8% undecided. It's that 6.8% that's going to come home, I believe, I fervently believe. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if there is a bit of the pro-Palestinian holdout. There could be some Cop City grassroots holdout. But, amongst independents, this is big. 50.4% for Kamala Harris to 34.1% for Donald Trump. And then they broke it down by income. For those who make less than $25,000, that vote swung largely to Kamala Harris, 64.4 to 28.9. It's very much a mixed message for the middle class. The low middle class swings for Donald Trump by about 9%. It swings back to Kamala Harris for those making between $50,000 and $75,000. That swings back to Kamala Harris, again, by about 9%. And then pretty much a dead heat for those making between $75,000 to $100,000. Less than 2% margin there. Those who make between $100,000 to $200,000 a year, that is a 11% margin for Donald Trump. And for those who make more than $150,000 a year, a 0.4% razor-thin margin. So a lot of cool little morsels, nuggets to take away from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution polling that just came out. This is, I believe, post-debate as well. Here's the other thing to keep in mind. When we look at the margin now, again, a statistical tie, 2.5% overall, and then compare it to July. It was the first time the Atlanta Journal-Constitution had an opportunity to poll the Georgia voter. The margin was 51 to 46. Donald Trump is under the 50% threshold. I've always said that's really important, especially for, well, in 2020, it's important for an incumbent. It's hard to say who mentally is the incumbent in this case, because one is running to maintain the administration's hold on the White House, and the other is running to get elected to a position he had before. But 50%. If you can't cross that 50% threshold as an incumbent, okay, so maybe it doesn't matter here. But I still think the 50% thing is really important, especially with a known commodity, somebody who has served in the office before. And that's why I believe Republicans are working feverishly to play the, well, why hasn't she done this argument with all of her policy positions. Maybe this is not scintillating audio to listen to via podcast, but I find, first of all, I'm a polling geek. I've said this from when a new poll comes out and there's crosstabs, I want to dive right in. I'm going to spend a little bit more time. In fact, I'll just give you a good bit of the New York Times newsletter that came adjacent to some new polling from Pennsylvania and nationally as well. Nate Cohen writing this. It's called the Tilt newsletter. It came to a New York Times subscribers this morning. That'll give us a sense of where Pennsylvania polling is going in a similar trajectory, and national polling are going as well. Post-debate, this is trending well, but again, foot on the gas, got to keep the work going, right? Got to keep at this. Take nothing for granted. So we'll dive into that. We'll give you Nate Cohen's The Tilt newsletter verbally through me. Also, reaction to the Federal Reserve's surprising rate cut. Surprising in how large it was. Surprised me. The Ron Show on America One Radio and Progressive Voices via TuneIn. Can I tell you, by the way, one of my favorite social media follows, and a super nice guy, too. We've had him on the show a couple times. King Williams. I am King Williams on the Twitter X platform. He's also on Substack. You can follow him, get his newsletter, The Breakdown by King Williams. Great follow. Enjoy following him. He has some good insights. In working in politics, it never surprises me how much people take into account the yard sign factor. There is a lot of psychology behind folks seeing enough yard signs of their preferred candidate that makes them feel more confident. I wish I'm sure somebody's done a case study on this. I just know what I know. And having worked for and volunteered with congressional campaigns and state senate, it's consistent. Folks want to know, where are the yard signs? Can I get a yard sign? I'd love to help. Can I get some yard signs out? King tweeted about 24 hours ago that the Dems street team isn't moving like the election isn't less than 50 days away, he says. There hasn't been the same level of yard signs, billboards, radio spots, TV ads, door knocking, local influencers, and partnerships like in 2020. He continues, they need to pick that up if they want to win. He continues, the Trump team is running local TV ads in every time block 24/7, sending out a ton of campaign mail. By the way, I'm getting Kamala campaign mail now, especially to young first-time black men. Running targeted social media and a national paid partnered influencer strategy, a podcast strategy aimed at young people. It seems like the 2024 Get Out the Vote campaign in Atlanta is being run by consultants and DC insiders, not people connected to Georgia and on the ground in Metro Atlanta. The ads on TV and social ads seem focus grouped to death, and it's missing local touches and timely responses, he tweets. He continues, what made the 2020 campaign work was that a lot of money was spread into local advocacy groups, influencers, and had several local ad and creative companies who could deploy several real-time efforts at once. No matter what medium or platform, you couldn't turn it off or in real life. And a lot of the key figures, he continues tweeting, I'll give you this in the show notes as well. And a lot of key figures from that election were already gone by 2022, and it showed. But in 2024, it's now almost all gone. It's one of the things that Republicans and conservatives understand better than Democrats and liberals. Supportive infrastructure is long-term. Boy, can I'll give them a here on that. It's it's not easy. Just in the nearly 2 years that I've had this show on, to garner a local Democratic Party official, office holder, it's not easy. It's work. And unfortunately, I can't even call this a side hustle because I'm not making money on it. It costs me money. By the way, feel free to donate to the show if you'd like. Join me at ronshowetl.com. There is a way to drop a little donation. My good friend Calvin, every month, reliably, drops enough for me to go get a fancy coffee. Thank you so much, Calvin. I appreciate that. Anyway, yeah, so this isn't even a side hustle for me. So when I'm done with this show, usually by 10 in the morning, I got to go on and go do the money-making thing. Residential real estate, usually it's a moneymaker. And we'll dive into what changes could come on that front with the interest rate drop. But, I can't devote time. I don't have a showrunner. I don't have someone, scheduling my guests. I do reach out to just about everybody. And I've had some success, and I've had a lot of non-responses. I'm trying to give a platform here that is obviously and decidedly left of center, but I firmly believe also fact-based. And there's not a lot of... I have tried several times, just a great example. I've tried several times to reach out to Fair Fight. You'd think they would want to be on this show. It's a friendly platform. I can't get anybody from Fair Fight to say, yeah, let's do this. Let's set this up. Okay, I got off topic there a little bit. King Williams continues tweeting, meaning conservatives year over year use their top donors to keep supporting think tanks, nonprofits, get out the vote organizations, ad creative agencies, and conservative media in on and off cycle years. So every year they're starting over, which annoys the base of donors, big and small. And instead of keeping those institutions on the supportive infrastructure side, at least partially funded, they have to keep finding new groups every single election cycle. He says they have no media to defend themselves with, leading to people having all types of opinions of the Dems. And the Dems have no sustainable media apparatus. The right would tell you, the mainstream media is we don't have Fox News. We don't have the Wall Street Journal. We don't have talk radio at near the strength and solidarity. We just don't. There's no overt, obvious, biased, pro-left mechanism that exists. Anyway, King continues, and the Dems have no sustainable media apparatus, local or national, to highlight policy changes. For example, pushing for IVF protections, abortion rights, policy wins, et cetera, and so on, like an infrastructure bill, or statements like, or stalemates like student loans. He says, relying too much on media and institutions to do that for them. And we know journalism is suffering. It's not journalisming like it used to. King says, if I were the Democrats, I would be putting a lot more long-term money into those local creative ad agencies, micro-local influencers, local media, regional podcasts and radio, alongside local get-out-the-vote organizations in all 10 swing states. Less D.C. and more next door. Because media, despite its reputation, is often run by conservative-leaning producers, board members, ad buyers, and donors, with conservative talking points and points of coverage. The Dems assume media would be favorable, something conservatives already know isn't. Okay, so to wrap this up, he tweets, if I was a Democratic leader, I would be spending more locally in Georgia now. King opines, open the purse and spin the block on the people who helped you get that win 4 years ago. Then do the same in North Carolina, Arizona, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, obviously. I admittedly don't watch a whole lot of OTA, over-the-air television, or terrestrial radio, if I'm being honest. So I can't speak to the television commercial variable. the social media. I can tell you, the mailers, and they're not actually coming, they're not addressed to me. They're addressed to someone who used to live at the same address. But obviously, whoever John is, who lived here before, he must have been a swing voter because he's getting it from both. But I do find it interesting, the yard sign factor. It's very much psychological, but there's something to be said for at least making people feel a little bit more confident about where our race is headed. I will say this. Harris literally just became the nominee like weeks ago. You don't amass a yard sign army, so to speak, in a matter of weeks. That's just a near impossibility in a small window. Also, let's be honest. Here in Metro Atlanta, the Cop City movement, I've said this since we started talking about it, a lot of local Democrats have pissed off grassroots organizers, and so they may be holding a grudge, not going out there and doing the door knocking like we're used to seeing of them doing. There's just a little bit of a fracture in Metro Atlanta when it comes to grassroots organizers. This is The Ron Show, America One Radio, Progressive Voices via TuneIn.
Follow The Ron Show on Facebook at The Ron Show Radio. The Ron Show on America One Radio.
I hate to judge somebody based on their short bio and their work, but I got to think Nate Cohn is probably not a lot of fun at parties. He is the chief political analyst at the New York Times. He covers American politics, a focus on elections, public opinion, demographics, and polling. Although, maybe because of what he does right now, he is a ton of fun. An audience captor at parties right now, because maybe folks want to pick his brain. Well, what are you seeing? And what does it look like? And what do you think? That's exactly what we're going to get when I share with you his latest newsletter called The Tilt, which comes out after batches of polling comes out. The headline from Nate Cohn is that Kamala Harris is ahead in Pennsylvania and tied nationally. And in this newsletter, he tries to unpack what he believes is an unexpected result. He says, although it could simply reflect the normal variations of polling results, it may also point to a declining Trump edge in the Electoral College. And we all know, kids, the Electoral College is where it's at. Nate writing, we have our first two polls since last week's presidential debate, one national poll and one poll of Pennsylvania. Combined, they're a bit of a puzzle. In the national poll, Kamala Harris and Donald J. Trump are tied among likely voters, 47 to 47. A slight gain for Ms. Harris since our last national survey taken immediately before the debate. And by the way, there are a lot of outlier polls. This is not him talking, this is me. There are a lot of outlier polls that show that she actually has a growing margin in the national polling. I've seen anywhere from 5 to 8%. Anyway, back to Cohn's writing. In the national poll, at the same time, Ms. Harris had a 4-point lead in a New York Times, Philadelphia Inquirer, Siena College poll of Pennsylvania, a margin of 50 to 46%. Before getting into the head-scratching details, let's start with the big picture. Not much change since the debate, he writes. There's some truth to that. Despite a strong debate performance, he writes, Vice President Harris did not gain much ground compared with our last polls of the nation in Pennsylvania. The poll is full of evidence that our respondents thought she did well in the debate and that Mr. Trump did poorly. But it hasn't made a big difference, at least for now, and at least in our polling. By the way, Donald Trump was on with Greg Gutfeld recently on Fox News and has a recollection about the last debate that no one can corroborate because it's a lie. Or maybe he's just so old that his memory's going.
Correct her once, and they corrected me everything I said practically. And I think 9 times or 11 times. And the audience was absolutely, they went crazy.
What?
And the real, I thought it was, I walked off, I said, that was a great debate. I loved it. You know, you got a lot of people watch. I guess we had 75 million people watching, something like that.
I mean, show of hands, how many of us remember that there was no audience in either debate? He said the audience went wild. What? What audience? Huh? Okay. Back to Nate Cohn's, him talking about the debate made me think about that. He continues writing, Mrs. Harris may not have gained much, but her campaign will surely be happy with the result in Pennsylvania. The national result, on the other hand, is quite favorable for Mr. Trump. That's the head-scratcher part that Nate Cohn says he's going to examine. But our elections are decided by the Electoral College, and no state figures more prominently in the electoral math than Pennsylvania. Now let's consider our puzzle, Nate Cohn writes. A clear lead for Ms. Harris in Pennsylvania, but it's high nationwide. This is unexpected, he writes. 4 years ago, President Biden won the national vote by 4.5 percentage points, but won Pennsylvania by just 1.2 points. Similarly, he says, our poll averages have shown Mrs. Harris doing better nationwide than in Pennsylvania. This poll is nearly the opposite, he writes. Usually, Nate writes, I'd say that this is probably just statistical noise, the inevitable variation in poll results inherent to random sampling. And it might well be, as we shall see. But I think it's hard to assume that this is simply noise for two reasons. One, he writes, it's what we've shown before. It's easy enough to dismiss any single poll result as a statistical fluke, but we've now found similar results in our last two polls of the nation in Pennsylvania. Although, to me, two polls isn't exactly like empirical. The second point he makes is this is becoming a trend among high-quality pollsters. And he goes into a whole note about what he calls a high-quality pollster and blah, 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 blah. When you focus on these high-quality polls, he writes, you get a surprising picture. There are a lot of good polls for Mr. Trump nationally and a lot of polls showing Ms. Harris doing relatively well in the northern battleground states like Pennsylvania, also Wisconsin and Michigan. Scrolling further down, Nate Cohen says, the lower quality polls have generally shown the opposite relationship. Better for Mrs. Harris nationwide, but better for Mr. Trump in the key northern states. You may wonder why we include lower quality pollsters in our averages at all, but many of them do have value, and in some cases they have even been more accurate than polls we typically think of as higher quality. Well, that's counterintuitive, right? They receive less weight in our national average, he writes, but they do receive some, enough to sometimes cancel out these select pollsters, given their greatest numbers. Cohen writes, what's clear is that the recent results from higher quality polls are very different from those of the last presidential election. If true, it would suggest that Mr. Trump's advantage in the Electoral College relative to the popular vote has declined significantly since 2020. Hand to heaven. This wouldn't come from nowhere. Almost exactly 1 year ago, Nate Cohen wrote, I wrote that there were signs that Mr. Trump's Electoral College advantage edge was fading, including in the 2022 midterm elections. In fact, today's poll result is reminiscent of our polling ahead of the midterms, which found Republicans leading nationally, but Democrats running strong in Pennsylvania and other battlegrounds. It was hard to believe given recent history. I didn't believe it, Nate Cohen writes, and neither did other pollsters I spoke with, but it turned out to be right. He says, we will re-examine the case for a fading Trump Electoral College advantage soon, including a dive into the geographic distribution of his strength in Times Seattle national surveys over the last year. A post-debate mirage, the next headline. The period after a debate is always fraught for pollsters. One reason, the supporters of the consensus winner of the debate might become especially energized and likelier to respond to a poll. That is true. While the poll didn't show much shift, there were signs that Democrats were likelier to respond than usual, which may be cause for caution. Overall, white Democrats were 20% likelier to respond than white Republicans. And indeed, Ms. Harris' strength in the poll was concentrated amongst white college graduates, the group you might expect to be newly energized after a debate. There were also a few signs the more committed Pennsylvania Democratic voters were especially likely to respond on the first night or two of polling immediately after the debate. Skipping a few lines to get to a point, it's hard to say whether any of this affected the result of the survey, but it suggests the debate at least temporarily influenced who wanted to take a poll. It's also a reminder that the campaign plays out very differently in the key battleground states. I happen to think that the swap atop the ticket and her debate performance are positive signs of the voter that Democrats count on coming home will actually do so. That's me talking, not Nate Cohen. Speaking of post-debate performance, as I mentioned earlier, Donald Trump was on with Greg Gutfeld, Fox News. I mean, it's crazy how much he will trash Fox News and then be readily available for Fox News. And, of course, seems to have an open line on Fox and Friends anytime he wants to call in and take over a segment or two or show. Anyway, he was on with Gutfeld. He was talking a little bit about, the post-debate vibes. We heard a little bit of that before where he evoked the audience going wild. There was no audience. There was an audience for this, however.
But it's interesting to see the response to this second attempt. Every time you're under a bigger threat, the media still blames you even more.
Yeah.
It's almost as though they don't see their own role in this. What do you make? Have you just basically accepted this as a fact?
I think so, yeah. Look, the media is extremely dishonest, extremely corrupt, actually. Look at the debate I walked off. I said, that's debate. You know, they said I'm the GOAT in debates because I had a lot of debates and I became president. And the GOAT means greatest of all time. He's a GOAT.
Oh, is that what it means?
What a great stage. And I walked off that stage and I thought I had the best debate. And I was very unfairly treated by the anchor. I'm not fans of those guys anymore.
A few seconds later.
And I think my only regret is that I wanted to be elegant and I didn't want to go after the anchors. I wish I did, in a way.
Well, that's our job.
Exactly, yeah. It's the Fox News media's job to whine about moderators. Okay, enough about that. So we had a huge rate cut. The Federal Reserve lowering interest rates, not by 0.25%, as I expected, and most experts, by the way, but by a full 0.5%. I didn't say it wasn't possible they were going to do it. I just didn't think they were going to go full throat, because that's just not what the Fed has historically done under this chairman and in recent years. They've been more cautious, more reserved. And then yesterday they're like, you get a rate cut. And anyway, we'll dive into the ramifications of that when the Ron Show returns here on America One Radio and Progressive Voices. Thank you for listening to the Ron Show, whether it's on the America One Radio app, AmericaOneRadio.com, via podcast. I mentioned before you can follow the Ron Show on your preferred social media platforms, right? Did I do that? Ron Show ATL, at Ron Show ATL, Twitter, X, Instagram, Facebook, Threads. Show notes, as always, at RonShowATL.com. It's funny how anything that's good for America that's bad for Trump, Vance, or the Republican Party is just so obvious. It's obvious to them. And yesterday's Federal Reserve rate cut of 0.5%, with an anticipation, by the way, of there being more, probably, I would say not before the election. I don't know, maybe before the election. Maybe one more. Oh, insult to injury, right? More salt in their wound. But projecting that there will be, 6 to 8 more rate cuts to come in the coming 18 months. I mean, that is good. That is good news for America. I have been saying since April on this show that the Fed needs to realize we're at the soft landing that they've been waiting for. It's not as nice as they would have liked it, but it's there. It's where we've settled in the 3%, year-over-year inflation, and should see that even improve slightly in the coming months. But man, news of the Fed doing what the Fed needed to do, in my mind, since April, not popular with the rally-goers at a J.D. Vance rally when he took a question from the Wall Street Journal.
The question is...
Really quickly, just on the Fed cutting. It's a very Wall Street Journal-y question, but the Fed cut the interest rate today by 0.5 percentage point. Going to alleviate inflation for a lot of people, and so if you have any reaction to that, we'd love it.
Well, look, my reaction is...
Booze.
My reaction is a 0.5 point is nothing compared to what American families have been dealing with for the last 3 years.
Yeah, I mean, as you can hear by the audience, in both times you heard from the audience, they're not happy with the rate cut, which is good, but they're also not happy with inflation being what it's been. This is the disconnect. See, that's what confuses me about the MAGA voter. That's what confuses me about the MAGA voter. Inflation has been a global issue. We have said that many times on this show. Inflation has been a global issue, a conundrum for global leaders to try and tackle in their countries, in their economic regions, the European Union, and here in the United States. However, in the United States, the U.S. actually fared better than most of the rest of the world when it comes to inflation. Like, it wasn't as bad here as it could have been and as it was in other parts of the country. And there are factors outside of anyone's control. For example, outside of the Biden-Harris control, they didn't make Vladimir Putin invade Ukraine, affecting gas prices. They also did not contribute to and try to undo a deal between Donald Trump and OPEC to suppress oil production in April of 2020. A 2-year deal, by the way, that OPEC would not relent on, and only recently actually even did start opening their spigots a little bit more. That's why you're seeing gas throughout Metro Atlanta and Georgia below $3 a gallon now. Are those Biden I did that sticker still on the tanks? Do we have some of those left over? Y'all want to put any of those out now? Now, anyway, the Federal Reserve had a hand in inflationary costs and household budgets when you figure that the cost to borrow money affects businesses who are supplying goods to you as well, which is why I think we'll continue to see prices come down on a lot of things. Vehicles, anything from vehicles to things you're buying at the grocery store, department store, Walmart, Target. Homes eventually as well. We already have seen, I said this yesterday, a preemptive lowering of mortgage rates into the low sixes. You're not hearing a whole lot of talk about that, but that's pretty profound. It was at 8%, like not all that long ago. Now it's in the low sixes. And with a lot of incentives, by the way, I'm a residential realtor. I can help you with this if you have any questions. You can get some incentives that get you down into the high to mid fives, sometimes even down into the threes with some rate buy downs. The first year, second year, third year, they do a 1, 2, 3 thing where you can go down 3 percentage points and then 2 and then 1. For new home builders, I mean, that's not nothing. So we'll see what the Fed's impact will be on costs as well. It's kind of funny how they're reacting to inflation, but they actually have been contributing to it as well. And the gas. Again, all of this out of the Biden-Harris controls. And J.D. Vance is not a stupid man. He believes his base is. He knows that all of the things I've just said are steeped in fact. But it's not going to get him elected. It's not going to get Donald Trump back in the White House. Nor is stating a fact that the dumpster fire that the Biden-Harris administration inherited was the dumpster fire that his running mate set. Even the Afghanistan kerfuffle, that was a deal that Biden-Harris didn't make but had to abide by and actually tried to extend it twice. Got extended once to try and help the Pentagon get their act together. And unfortunately, the release of the 5,000 Taliban terrorists from prisons aided the Taliban's takeover of Afghanistan, which just amplified and steamrolled the overtaking of the Afghan government by a terrorist organization that Donald Trump allowed to reinvigorate with those 5,000 troops. Anyway, getting off the topic there. The half percentage rate cut surprised me a little bit because, again, the Fed has been very measured, very reserved, very, I don't want to say conservative, but just cautious, very cautious in how they dictate monetary policy. But we had seen some signs that it was possible they'd go beyond a quarter of a percentage point and giddily to the half percentage point. We'd seen that happening in Europe with a lot of monetary policy wonks and organizations. Britain, I believe, did the very same thing. In fact, I think they've done 2 in the last 3 or 4 months. Don't quote me on that, but I think they've done 2. So maybe the Fed realized, you know what, we probably could have done it last time and we didn't. We just kind of waffled a little bit. Let's just go ahead and go 0.5%. I don't know. But again, that's good news for America, bad news for Trump Vance 2024. And it's not surprising. That doesn't surprise me at all. Because we've learned since Bill Clinton ran for president in 1992, it's the economy, stupid. It is. It's the economy. And if the economy is settling into a groove, and I've said for a while, we've kind of been on a little bit of a heater. If the economy is settling into a groove, then you can anticipate that the American public will feel pretty strongly about the folks already in control of the economy. In their minds, I've said all along, I don't think the White House has nearly the impact on the economy as a lot of American voters think it does. There's a lot of stewardship involved and a lot of guidance. And obviously there is policy that can be. And we're debating about tax policy. We're debating about child care, the cost of it, and how to address it, and child care tax credits, or Donald Trump's dangerous proposal to add more tariffs on goods, which is going to be counterintuitive to what we're going to experience over the next 6 to 8 weeks as we start seeing prices on core items and big ticket items go down. He wants to reverse that with tariffs. That makes this a pretty clear choice for the American voter. Yeah, yesterday's Federal Reserve news was not good for Trump Vance or down ballot Republicans as well. And you heard the audience react. And you heard J.D. Vance try to spin that. Despite the fact that he, I believe a Harvard graduate, is smart enough to know better. He just knows that the crowd he was in front of and the crowd that he relies on for votes and support, cash contributions, either isn't smart enough to understand the complexities of the economy, or they have other factors that fuel their animus against Democrats. Like, he's thrown a lot of kindling on xenophobia and racism lately, right? Yet to concede that the missing cat, who, by the way, was found in the basement days later, the woman who made that post, she's like, actually, Miss Sassy she was just hiding in the basement. Well, Senator Sassy doesn't seem to know that, because they're still out there promoting these nut job theories about Haitian immigrants eating pets. There was actually another lie that he's been spreading a little bit, and let me see if I can find this. Oh, here it is. I just shared this morning at Ron Show ATL on the Twitter X platform. Greg Sargent at The New Reporting tweets, J.D. Vance is also claiming that because of Haitians, communicable diseases in Springfield have skyrocketed. J.D. Vance's words. Greg Sargent says, I talked to the health commissioner in Clark County where Springfield is located. Vance's claim is nonsense. Here's a little excerpt. But it's very hard to square Vance's claims of skyrocketing diseases with official health data from Clark County, home to Springfield. That data shows that reportable communicable diseases in the county, excluding COVID-19, which dwarfs all others and surged during the pandemic for many other reasons, actually have declined in a broader sense. Despite a rise in 2022 that was the exception, they were actually lower in 2023 than they were in 2021, when the Haitian influx gained steam, which in turn was lower than 2020, before their arrivals really got going. The overall trend from 2020 through the end of 2023 is downward, not upward. Chris Cook, Health Commissioner, Clark County, telling Greg Sargent, if you look at all the reportable diseases as a whole, they're actually going down. Vance has also specifically suggested that cases of tuberculosis and HIV are rising or even soaring. But according to the county's data, there was one case of TB in 2021, 3 in 2022, 4 in 2023. Okay, that sort of constitutes rising, but it's a tiny handful of cases out of a county population of 135,000. What about HIV, Greg Sargent writes? Well, in 2022, the latest year of finalized data, there are around 9 cases of new HIV diagnosis per 100,000 people in Clark County. That is up from 5 cases in 2020, but that 9 cases is barely higher than the current rate across all of Ohio, which had 7 new cases per 100,000 people in 2022. And if you look at the numbers of people living with HIV as a condition as opposed to new cases of it, there are fewer per 100,000 in Clark County than there are statewide, Cook points out. Every case of TB and HIV is serious, but there's no plausible way to describe any of that in Vance's hyperbolic terms. Indeed, Cook describes those diseases as getting only a, quote, slight bump, and suggests that singling out individual diseases is not particularly illuminating to begin with. As a measure of total health of a population, Cook says, individual diseases are less informative than trends of groups of diseases, and those trends are down. It's hard to see how anyone could seriously cast all of this as a severe blight caused by Haitians. But what did Vance say?
But it wasn't just a meme.
Create stories so that the American media actually pays attention, then that's what I'm going to do.
Creating stories so that the American media will pay attention to falsehoods. It's going to do it for today's Ron Show. Replay 5 to 6 p.m. on America One Radio, 7 to 8 p.m. at Progressive Voices via TuneIn. Show notes at ronshowatl.com. Have a great day. We'll see you tomorrow.